Brothers and sisters, Biden and Harris just gave the Native American community $31 billion at the top of this year. And you're telling me that now that same community, after receiving $31 billion, can also eat off the plate of the history of slavery, reconstruction, and Jim Crow? Before we dive into today's video, what I want to do is lay down the proper foundation so that we can all understand the seriousness behind the current erasure and or dilution of Black history. And understand, when I say Black history, I'm talking about the history of the descendants of American slavery. Laying down this foundation will help us better understand and get a grasp of why and how politicians like Kamala Harris are able to conflate Black history with the history of other so-called people of color and get away with it with zero resistance. So what I want to do now is play a segment of a live stream that I did last year on December 20th of 2020 titled AOC and Progressive Dems Want Reparations for People of Color, Not Descendants of American Slavery. What I pointed out in my last video when I read this the last time, somebody said in the comment section, you said that they're not talking about Black people, because nowhere in this little description that I read to you do you see Black people, Black American, or African Americans, let alone the technical terms that some of us like to use, like ADOS, FBA, or I say Descendants of American Slavery. When I made that statement, somebody commented and said, well, they said slavery and Jim Crow, so that's Black people. That's descendants of American slavery. What are you talking about? And what I want to propose to you today, and some of you might be aware of this already, is that if it's not defined, if you do not see Black Americans, African Americans, descendants of American slavery, whatever, if there's no definition as to who they're talking to, it is not a foregone conclusion that when you say slavery and Jim Crow, you're talking about Black people. It's not a foregone conclusion anymore. One of the papers that I want to pull up right now to prove this point is this. Okay, let me read this off to you. And I've read this off in a video before, but I'm going to read this off to you one more time. Because as crazy as it sounds, it is not a foregone conclusion that when you say slavery and Jim Crow, you're talking about the descendants of American slavery, let alone Black people as a whole. So let's get into that. Let me pull this up for you, okay? This paper right here is titled A Brief History of Slavery and the Origins of American Policing. All right? I'll read it again. A Brief History of Slavery and the Origins of American Policing. This was written by Dr. Victor E. Kapler. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to read his bio on LinkedIn, but what I will do is that I will copy paste his bio to, I will copy paste the link to his bio in LinkedIn in the live chat, so you can click on it yourself, and you'll see that this Dr. Kapler, he's no schmuck. He's no YouTube or Google scholar. He is a very well-respected academic. So now in this paper titled A Brief History of Slavery and the Origins of American Policing, let's scroll down a bit to the highlighted section that I have here. Now, read along with me, all right? The legacy of slavery and racism did not end after the Civil War. In fact, it can be argued that extreme violence against people of color became even worse with the rise of vigilante groups who resisted Reconstruction. Because vigilantes, by definition, have no external restraints, lynch mobs had a justified reputation of hanging minorities first and asking questions later. Because of its tradition of slavery, which rested on the racist traditions, which rested on the racist rationalizations that Blacks were subhuman, America had a long, shameful history of mistreating people of color long after the end of slavery. So, as you can see from what I read to you, it is no longer a foregone conclusion that when you say slavery or Jim Crow, that it automatically means Black people. It's not what that means automatically anymore. And you see how people continue to play on this. And I want to keep going with this brief review of what I covered last week. Let's go to Jamal Bowman's website, where he spoke on in detail, or laid out in detail, what's called the reconstruction agenda, right? Now, recently, Kamala Harris and Janet Yellen spoke at a forum that they titled the Freedman's Bank Forum. Brothers and sisters, there was no reason for this forum to be called that. They could have called it the People of Color, Minority, and Marginalized Groups Forum. They could have called it the Economic Justice Forum. Any other name would have sufficed, but they made sure to call it the Freedman's Bank Forum for the sole purposes of diluting the history and relevance of the descendants of American slavery. Now, this is how the forum started out. They started out by talking about the tragedy of Tulsa and the destruction of Black Wall Street. Then from there, they go to slavery and the history of economic injustice that the descendants of American slavery dealt with in the past and continue to deal with till this day. But you don't have to take my word for it. We can just get into those clips right now.
Mother Fletcher and Mr. Van Ellis were just children when a white supremacist mob burned down Black-owned homes and businesses and decimated the Greenwood district. But 100 years later, the memory of that tragedy, the smoke in the streets, the piles of bodies, was fresh in their minds, as was the memory of the thriving community that they lost. An economy in which Black people supported one another, lift one another up, and modeled excellence, in which Black people could determine their own future. So I talk about that today because I believe we must draw from the lessons of Greenwood and Freedman's, of Sweet Auburn and Blaylock Van. Here's what I know to be true. America is a nation that is driven by the ambition and the aspirations of her people. But I also know that in America today, deep racial disparities continue to hold people back from achieving all they can. Today, the wealth gap persists. Today, the homeownership gap persists. Today, access to capital is unequal. As one example, Black entrepreneurs are 3 times more likely to report that a lack of access to capital negatively affects their profit margins. I believe that the actions we are taking and must take to address these disparities will define our nation's strength and economic strength in the 21st century.
Now, you would have thought that after saying all of this, the next follow-up statements would have been about reparations and economic justice exclusively for the descendants of American slavery. But then again, we are talking about the Democratic Party.
In a moment, the Secretary and I are going to sit down here and we're going to discuss some of the intentional actions that our administration is taking to lower costs for families and to remove barriers to success within all communities. Today, I'm very proud to announce that almost $9 billion is now available to increase lending to small businesses in underserved communities. I have consulted with many community lenders who serve tribal communities.
Wait, are they talking about Native Americans?
If in fact a calculation comes to you that you are satisfied with, would you then say, I'm for reparations?
The answer is it would depend on what it was and will it include Native Americans as well.
I'm sorry for interrupting. Let's just keep the video going. My apologies.
In the plains of South Dakota, where Native women are making quilts that are important to their community, knowing there is a market for it based on the culture and traditions of those communities, and who needed a community lender. They needed a lender, but it just so happens that the community lenders understand best the needs of these communities and see the potential then for growth.
Brothers and sisters, Biden and Harris just gave the Native American community $31 billion at the top of this year. And you're telling me that now that same community, after receiving $31 billion, can also eat off the plate of the history of slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow? Now here's my question. How much of that $31 billion going to the Native American community can the Black community get? What's our share of that $31 billion? And you see, that's the problem. And the Democrats do this deliberately. Everybody gets to eat off the plate of the descendants of American slavery, but the actual descendants of American slavery. Now understand, what I condensed for you so far was only the first 12 minutes of a 47-minute long form. But believe me when I tell you, the remaining 35 minutes carried on in the same fashion.
The bank failed, and more than 61,000 African Americans lost their savings. Douglas's biographer, David Blight, called the affair one of the great aspirations, but also one of the great tragedies of Reconstruction. We're here today because, in many ways, we're still living with both that aspiration and that tragedy. The Vice President just described this very well. From Reconstruction to Jim Crow to the present day, our economy has never worked fairly for Black Americans, or really for any American of color, or really for any American of color, or really for any American of color. Well, since stepping foot in this building last January, we have tried to change that, to finally make good on the aspiration of the Freedmen's Bank by transforming how Treasury works. Our most recent measure, though, is the news that the Vice President just mentioned. Through our Emergency Capital Investment Program, or ECIP, Treasury will be injecting nearly $9 billion into community development financial institutions and minority depository institutions. These CDFIs and MDIs serve communities that the financial sector historically has not served well. And most of the time, these are communities of color. If you're a Black or Hispanic or Asian or a Native entrepreneur, we know it's harder to get your hands on funding to open a shop or to keep the lights on or to meet customer demand. In their recent small business credit survey, the Fed found that while roughly 40% of white-owned firms reported receiving all the non-emergency funding they sought last year, the number for Hispanic-owned firms was just half that, 21%.
The words and terms people of color, minorities, marginalized groups, and underserved communities should never be brought up in the same sentence, breath, or even book for that matter when speaking on the history of slavery, freedmen's, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. That is wildly disrespectful, a disrespect that largely comes from the Democrats. Please remember that come election time. And I already know there's going to be somebody in the comment section disingenuously saying, well, what's the solution? Are you saying we should have voted for Trump? And I'll answer that briefly by saying this. The solutions are coming in future videos. Just make sure you subscribe and be on the lookout for them. But here's your problem to the one that's asking me that question. Those solutions require work. And you don't really want to do no work now, do you? That's why you keep defaulting to the Democratic Party, who consistently slaps you in the face and does nothing for you. But don't worry, the solutions are coming. The real question is, are you ready to do the work? And with all that being said, that does it for today's video. Please make sure you hit the subscribe button as well as the bell notification next to the subscribe button so you can be notified whenever I release a new video. All social media links will be pinned in the comment section below. Please make sure you text tdhiphop to number 33222. That's tdhiphop to number 33222. That way you'll get a direct text notification whenever I release a new video, but it also serves as a protection plan for myself in case YouTube ever gives this channel the axe. I'll be able to send you a direct link to where you can find me next. And last but not least, for those of you who have a love and appreciation for the work that I put in on this channel, the number one way you can show your support is through Patreon. For only $3 a month, that will help put me in position to take TD Hip Hop Media off of YouTube. Remember, the goal is not to grow big on YouTube, but to grow independent of YouTube. And for those who have issues with joining Patreon, you could also hit the join button that's next to the subscribe button, and that way you can become an official channel member for as little as $3 a month as well. And lastly, if you have not already, please make sure you join the emailing list. There is no way that I can go independent of YouTube if I cannot take the audience with me. And the link to that will be pinned in the comment section as well. Thank you for your time, and until the next video, peace.